Moving into that quiet neighborhood was supposed to be my fresh start. New street, new routines, new silence. After years of feeling invisible in crowded places, I told myself peace was what I needed. The first morning there, I was carrying boxes from my car when I heard the sharp sound of fists hitting leather. Over the low fence next door, I caught sight of him, shirtless under the morning sun, gloves on, moving with a power that made the air feel charged. I recognized him instantly. Ryan Carter, rising MMA star. Straight, famous, already taken. I told myself to look away. I didn't. For days, I tried to keep my distance. I watched him from my window as he trained in the backyard before dawn, every movement disciplined, controlled. It fascinated me, not just the physical strength, but the quiet intensity behind it. I knew he was from social media and sports clips. He had a girlfriend, a public life. Everything about him existed in another world entirely from mine. Still, fate ignored my logic. One afternoon, the soccer ball from his yard rolled into mine. I kicked it back over the fence, and that was how it started. "Thanks, man," he said with an easy smile. Up close, he looked less like a star and more like someone trying very hard to hold everything together. That surprised me. We introduced ourselves. The conversation was simple. Weather, training, the neighborhood. Yet something about the way he lingered told me he wasn't in a rush to leave. Neither was I. A few days later, I met Megan. She came by during one of Ryan's rest days, laughing as she climbed out of her car with coffee in her hands. She was kind to me instantly, treating me like I had always belonged there. She spoke proudly about Ryan's upcoming fight, his discipline, his dream. From the outside, they looked solid, supportive, untouchable. But when Ryan looked at her, I noticed something quiet behind his eyes. Not cold, just distant. The moment everything shifted came sooner than I expected. One evening, Ryan injured his shoulder mid-training. I heard his pain shout before I saw him struggling near the fence. Megan wasn't home yet. Instinct moved faster than thought. I helped him inside, steadying his weight as he tried not to show how badly it hurt. There was nothing romantic about the moment, only concern, tension, vulnerability. Still, as I sat across from him holding an ice pack in place, something fragile opened between us. He let his guard down in a way fighters rarely do. After that, the late-night conversations began. We started talking from our balconies when the rest of the street had gone dark. About pressure, about expectations, about what it feels like to pretend you're always okay when you're not. He spoke about being trapped inside the version of himself the world expected. I listened, understanding more than he realized. I never spoke openly about who I was at first, but I think he already knew. He never asked. He never judged. Every night, the line felt thinner. I told myself to stop, to pull back, to remember Megan, to remember that some doors, once opened, can't be closed without damage. Yet when Ryan spoke, when his voice lost its armor, I stayed. I told myself I was only being a friend. I told myself friendship was harmless. One night, when the conversations had stretched longer than usual, he said something that landed heavier than any punch he'd ever thrown in a cage. "When I'm talking to you," he said quietly, "I don't feel like I have to perform. I can just be me." The silence after that was so thick, I could feel my pulse in my ears. I knew what it meant. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to be dangerous. I realized then that something had already begun without permission, without rules, without safety. No hands had crossed lines. No promises were broken aloud. Yet in that moment, standing on my balcony under a quiet sky, I understood the truth in a way that made my chest ache. We hadn't touched. We hadn't confessed. But the first line had already been crossed, and neither of us knew how to step back. After that night, everything between us shifted into a quiet, unspoken routine. Ryan began coming over more often under harmless excuses. Physical therapy sessions, borrowed tools, post-training soreness. Each reason sounded practical enough to hide what was really happening. We spent hours just talking, sometimes about the fights, sometimes about childhood memories, sometimes about nothing at all. Yet every minute carried a weight neither of us named. Megan still came by several times a week. When she did, Ryan became a different version of himself. Focused, smiling, attentive. I watched the transformation with a strange mix of guilt and sadness. I was starting to recognize the man he showed her was the man he was expected to be. The man he showed me was the one he had never learned how to explain. And I was beginning to realize how dangerous that made me. One evening, while rain hammered against both our windows, the power went out across the street. I was lighting candles when I heard him knock on my door. He stood there soaked, unsure, holding his phone like it had failed him personally. Without thinking, I let him in. We sat across from each other in the soft candlelight, the storm filling every silence with sound. He laughed nervously, rubbing his hands together. "I don't like being alone when it's like this," he admitted. So I stayed with him until the lights came back. At one point during the storm, the thunder cracked so loudly that he flinched and reached for me without thinking. His hand landed on my arm. The touch was brief, instinctive, and enough to make both of us freeze. Neither of us moved for several seconds. Then he pulled his hand back quickly, apology written all over his face. "Sorry." Reflex. I nodded, pretending it hadn't shaken me, pretending my heartbeat hadn't betrayed me completely. After that night, he grew quieter, not more distant, but more thoughtful. He began watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. Once, during a pause in conversation, he asked softly, "Do you ever wish you could just rewrite the parts of your life that don't fit?" I didn't answer right away. I just said, "Sometimes the parts that don't fit are the ones trying to tell us something." He didn't respond, but I could see the truth of that sentence settle into him. Pressure from the gym intensified as his joints healed. His coach pushed him harder every week, warning him that hesitation was weakness. Ryan carried that stress home with him. More than once, he showed up at my door late, not to talk, but simply to sit. We would share the quiet, the kind that speaks louder than words, the kind you only share with people you don't have to pretend with. Megan began to sense the change. She stopped smiling as easily when she visited. Her questions grew sharper. "You two talk a lot," she said once, not accusing, but not casual either. I answered carefully. She nodded, but the smallest crack had formed in her certainty. It haunted me. Every kind thing she had ever said to me replayed in my mind like a warning. One night, after a particularly brutal training session, Ryan broke. He admitted that he didn't understand what was happening to him anymore, that he felt pulled in directions he never expected, that nothing felt simple. He never used the word love. He never used the word attraction. But he didn't have to. His voice said what his lips couldn't. He stood across from me that night, hands shaking, breath uneven. For a moment, it felt like the world narrowed down to the space between us. Then it almost happened. He leaned forward, just slightly, not enough to touch, enough to confess everything without words. I whispered his name, not as an invitation, but as a reminder of who he was, of who he wasn't allowed to be yet. He stopped instantly. "I can't," he said, stepping back. "I can't hurt her." His words weren't weak. They were terrified and honest. That was the moment I realized the truth in full. Nothing physical had happened. No promises had been spoken. But something deeply committed had already taken shape beneath all of it. A bond made of shared silence, unguarded truth, and impossible timing. I went to bed that night, knowing we were no longer innocent, still untouched, still unharmed, but already standing on the wrong side of something that could no longer be undone. The night everything finally broke arrived without warning. Ryan lost his comeback fight under harsh lights and louder disappointment. The judge's decision fell like a stone, and the crowd's energy drained into uneasy silence. I watched from my living room screen, my hands shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with the match. An hour later, his knock came at my door, soft, uncertain, and exhausted. It sounded like the end of something I feared. I let him in without speaking. His eyes were hollow, not with defeat alone, but with the weight of everything he had been carrying. He didn't sit at first. He just stood there, breathing hard, like the fight still lived inside his chest. Then the truth came out in broken pieces. He said He didn't know who he was becoming anymore. He said thinking of me had steadied him. In that moment, the room felt small. I told him the truth then, carefully and quietly. I admitted that the bond between us was no longer innocent, that it mattered in ways neither of us had planned. His hands trembled as he nodded, not in surprise, but in recognition. He confessed he was in love with me, not as a choice, but as a realization that had grown without permission. I felt both seen and terrified by it, because fragile love can destroy. Before either of us could say more, the front door opened behind him. Megan stood there, frozen with her keys still in her hand. She had heard enough. The silence stretched until Ryan finally turned around and saw her face. There was no shouting, no collapse, just a quiet devastation that felt heavier than any storm. She asked one question in a voice that barely trembled. How long? Ryan couldn't answer at first, and was enough. Megan didn't cry. That hurt more than anything. She listened as Ryan tried to explain what had never been touched, but had still been built. Emotional closeness. Late nights. The truth without protection. When he finished, she nodded once. She said betrayal did not always need hands to be real. Then she walked back out the door with her dignity intact and her heart visibly fractured. The sound of it closing echoed through every part alike. The consequences arrived fast and without mercy. News travels quickly when fame is involved. Sponsors withdrew with careful statements about values and image. His coach stopped answering calls. Invitations vanished. The fighter identity he had built for years cracked in public. Ryan tried to apologize to me for everything he had lost, as if loving me had been a failing instead of a truth. That nearly broke me more than any accusation could. This was payment. I knew then what I had to do, even though it tore through me. I loved him, but I would not be the place he hid while his life collapsed. I told him he needed to stand alone for a while and face what had been broken honestly. He argued through tears. I didn't. I held my ground even as every part of me wanted to reach for him and keep him safe. And that hurt. We separated not with anger, but with grief. The kind that walks beside you instead of passing through. Weeks turned into months. His career stalled. My nights grew quieter. I followed his progress from a distance, careful not to interfere. He learned to live without the armor of expectation. I learned to live without the hope that had nearly undone me. Healing was slow, uneven, and painfully honest for both of us. In that waiting, change. He came back into my life on an ordinary afternoon, no cameras, no crowd, no borrowed strength. Just Ryan, softer, clearer, single by choice. He told me he had ended everything cleanly months earlier and had spent the silence learning what honesty really demanded. There was no rush in his voice this time, no hiding, only an open question about whether I would be willing to begin again without shadows. I felt fear, hope, and truth. We didn't touch it first. We just talked the way two people do when everything that once hid between them is finally gone. There was no victory in it, no fantasy ending, only intention, only care, only earned possibility. When we did decide to try again, it was as two people no longer stealing moments from anyone. It was quieter than the beginning, and far more real than anything that came before. That was the love.